phenomenal show that Ron did with us. Fantastic show. So I asked him to do an abbreviated version here for you, and that's what we're going to give you today. Ron Scott Jr. is the cultural diversity community. I'm having trouble speaking today. Sorry about that. Let me start over. Ron Scott Jr. is Cultural Diversity and Community Outreach Director at the YWCA in Wheeling. He's so much more than that. Here is Ron Scott. He'll tell you about it. Yeah.
Hey, how you guys? Ooh, hello. You hear me? Okay. How you guys doing? All right. I'm pretty excited about doing this one because, as Sean was telling you, we did one version at the Capitol Ballroom, History of Black Music. It was phenomenal. We had a lot of area artists come out, and it was one of the things that I'm most proud of that I've ever gotten to do. But we're going to give you guys a snippeted version of what that was like with the help of my man Ezra and my man Pops. We are going to give you guys the best version of this that we know how to right now. Music. Aside from the billion-dollar industries, the trends, and the fashions, music serves so many different purposes to each of us. To some, it soothes our soul. To others, it calms our spirits. To a good bit of us, it's the soundtrack that is displayed while we're cooking, cleaning, and driving. I've never met a person that didn't have a connection to music, whether it's big or small. In this country, music is tied to every facet of our lives. We sing lullabies to our children. We dedicate songs to our crushes. We have a first dance with our bride or groom, and most couples out here have a song that when they hear it say, "This is our song." I'd be willing to bet that more than half of you woke up to music as your alarm this morning. In terms of race, creed, and religion, and gender, music transcends. In terms of demographics, geographical locations, and languages, music unites. In terms of cultures, nations, and human experiences, music contributes. It contributes in more ways than anyone in this room could ever imagine. This afternoon, we're going to talk about how music itself has been shaped by one of the many groups of people who've made up this country. Since this is the designated month for Black history, we're going to talk about the African American, Black folks, and our influence over music in the United States of America. The first Africans transported to this country came from a variety of ethnic groups with a long history of distinct and cultivated musical traditions. Over time, many distinct practices and traditions of African music were either forgotten or blended with other musical traditions. Nevertheless, African music continued to flow into the New World because of the slave trade, which continued illegally well into the 19th century despite its official abolition in 1808. The Negro spiritual. One of the most widespread of early musical forms among Southern blacks was the spiritual. Whether they were black versions of white hymns or transformations of songs from Africa, spirituals were a distinct African American response to American conditions. They expressed the longing of slaves for spiritual and bodily freedom, for safety from harm and evil, and for relief from the hardships of slavery. Many of the songs offered coded messages. Some contained coded instructions for escape to the North. Others conveyed the feelings of despair that blacks felt. The spirituals also served as critiques of slavery, using biblical metaphors to protest the enslavement of black people. The spirituals also provided African Americans with a means of transcending their enslaved conditions by imagining a life of freedom. In the early part of the 1900s, because of the work of black composers, the performance of Negro spirituals became a tradition among black singers, particularly singers of classical music. Composers like Harry T. Buell, Margaret Bonds, and Hall Johnson set the spirituals to piano accompaniment as a means by presenting and preserving the beauty of this traditional black music. In the early 2000s, black concert singers such as Jesse Norman and Kathleen Battle continued to perform the composer's arrangements. I like to let a lot of these medleys play before we move to the next one because some of this stuff I never get to hear. Performing a selection of Negro spirituals Please welcome Ezra Hamilton. Good. It's like a pit crew. Hang right in there. Next up, we have ragtime. Ragtime became the first nationally popular form of American music in 1899 when Scott Joplin's Maple Leaf Rag enjoyed unprecedented success, selling over 1 million sheet music copies. But ragtime was not new in 1899. Documents reveal that it was being played as early as the 1870s. Black musicians spoke of ragging a tune when describing the use of syncopated rhythms, whether it's classical compositions, popular music, or gentle dance tunes. While black musicians could rag tunes on any instrument, the music we call ragtime developed when the piano replaced the violin as the favorite instrument for dance accompaniment. Ragtime also evolved out of two other musical styles, the coon song and the cakewalk. Coon song was a racist term used to describe the music of white minstrels performing in blackface, and acts that were supposed to be humorous imitations of black slaves. Blackface minstrels were a popular entertainment form throughout most of the 19th century. The cakewalk was a stately ring dance performed by blacks during and after slavery. It was accompanied by music that was like ragtime and composed by such African Americans as Ernest Hogan, William Marion Cook, and the musical team of Bob Cole and Billy Johnson. These artists popularized this style of music and brought it to the Broadway and off-Broadway stages in the late 1800s. Next up, we got the blues. The blues is perhaps the simplest American musical form and yet also the most versatile. Along with jazz, blues takes its shape and style in the process of performance. And for this reason, it possesses a high degree of flexibility. Although certain musical and lyrical elements of the blues can be traced back to West Africa, the blues, like the spiritual, is a product of slavery. When and where did the blues originate? No one can say for sure. We know only that it began in the South during slavery, and in the years following slavery spread throughout the region as early bluesmen wandered from place to place. One of them, Bunk Johnson, claimed to have played nothing but blues as a child during the 1880s. As the nation moved into the 20th century, the blues evolved into a solo singer accompanying himself on the acoustic guitar. It was played on the farms of sharecroppers and in honky-tonk gin joints. People brought the music with them into the cities at the dawn of the industrial age. Early blues was an acoustical musical tradition, and it was invented and performed by literally a handful of unemployed musicians in search of day labor. Early practitioners such as Robert Johnson, widely regarded as the father of what we now call classical blues, a style popularized by black women like Ma Rainey, Bessie Smith, Olive Hunter, and Ethel Waters. During the 1920s, the interest shifted from classical blues sung by women to country blues, performed mostly by men. This down-home blues was sometimes performed with a banjo, a string, or a jug band. Although the favorite accompaniment was the guitar, in country blues, the vocal falsetto hummed and achieved percussive effects using both voice and instrument. Among the better-known country blues singers were Charlie Jackson, Blind Melon Jefferson, Robert Johnson, Blind Boy Fuller, Gus Cannon, and Huddy Leadbelly. The second great migration of the Mississippi Delta to Chicago in the 1940s produced a new blues form known as the Chicago blues. Native to the industrial city, Muddy Waters became the leading innovator of this new style after he reached Chicago in 1943. Muddy Waters and his contemporaries, among them Big Bill Broomsey, Howlin' Wolf, Jimmy Rogers, B.B. King, Bobby Blue Bland, Johnny Lee Hooker, and Willie Dixon, had been trained in the country style of acoustic guitar and solo performance. Now they built a new urban style around electric instruments and amplification. Electric guitar, harmonica, drums, bass guitar, and pianos were featured in these performances. Chicago blues offered a tight industrial sound, a hard-edged and hard-driving ensemble sound especially suited to telling stories of a country people adjusting to the industrial city. Chicago blues was part of the distinct culture rooted in the flowering city made possible by the black immigration. The blues chronicle the migration of African Americans northward. With that move, the music turned from acoustic to electric. Within the stylistic and cultural traditions of the blues, the African American experience of alienation, peril, and outright tragedy within American society was brought to light. It is an American art form, in the end, one that borrows from threads of artistic expression that is African, European, and immigrant, slave, rural, or urban, country or industrial. The music deals with the great themes of Western expression, loves that tend towards the unrequited, fates that lean toward the darkly predetermined, spiritual and sexual energies that drive individuals through the business of living. And performing a blues selection for you right now, Mr. Ezra Hamilton. Next up, we've got gospel music. The sound of today's gospel music also has a long history in African American music. By the 1930s, Roberta Martin, Sally Martin, and Thomas Dorsey, a former blues man who went by the name Georgia Tom Dorsey, had established the religious music whose sound became known as gospel. In the late 1920s, Dorsey began writing religious songs that combined the sustained lyrical quality of the spirituals with the more modern sound of the blues. Known for its slow, expressive, almost unmeasured pace, his signature song, Precious Lord, set the standard of early gospel music. Precious Lord was popularized by the singer Mahalia Jackson, the best known for the early gospel singers famed for her expressiveness and musical interpretation. The next evolution of gospel music was the gospel quartets and choirs of the 1930s and 1940s. Groups such as the Dixie Hummingbirds and the Claire Ward Singers used their close harmonies and a cappella singing to give black churches music unique and soulful in its sound. Later, gospel singers like Shirley Caesar and James Cleveland won fame amongst gospel enthusiasts for their inspirational and creative solos before choirs. Both Caesar and Cleveland excelled in the technique attributed to Willie Mae Ford Smith called sermonizing. Sermonizing involved the soloist's spoken narration of a story either before or during the choir singing. The soloist joined the choir in singing a refrain either during or after the spoken narration, and the song ended climactically when the soloist and the choir sung together. Although gospel music in the early 2000s often sounds like other forms of popular music, it still retains its early emphasis on vocal embellishment, dramatic power, and a lengthening of the song for the purposes of creating musical tension. In fact, gospel has had a greater historical influence on popular music than the reverse. Many soul and rhythm and blues singers like Sam Cooke, Aretha Franklin, and Whitney Houston began singing in black churches and in gospel choirs. Next, we got some jazz for you. Jazz has been called America's classical music. It is perhaps the most creative and complex music the nation has ever produced, although no one can say for sure where the origins of jazz lie. It combines the musical traditions of Black New Orleans with the creative flexibility of the blues. In 1918, the term jazz was already in wide use. Early jazz performers included the cornetist Sidney Beecher, the pianist Jelly Roll Morton, U.B. Blake, and the band leader James Reese Europe. Among the early ensembles were the original Dixieland Jazz Band and King Oliver's Creole Jazz Band. The trumpeter and singer Louis Armstrong became the first jazz musician to achieve national and international recognition with the success of his West End blues in the 1920s. Armstrong achieved stardom as a concertist in King Oliver's Creole Jazz Band and went on to form his own ensembles, the Hot Fives and the Hot Sevens. In the 1920s, Armstrong's lyricism and his technical and improvisational finesse pointed the way for many future jazz artists. Most revolutionary of jazz styles, bebop, was performed by an ensemble significantly smaller than the big band. A rhythm section consisting of a piano, string bass, drums, and sometimes guitars, which backed up soloists on trumpets or alto or tenor saxophones. Bebop evolved into the 1940s out of jam sessions. The tenor saxophonist Charlie Parker, the pianist Thelonious Monk, the guitarist Charlie Christian, and the drummer Kenny Clark all preceded the period of 1934 to 1939. Wheeling native Leon Brown Chew Berry was one of the several younger tenor saxophonists such as Bud Johnson, Ben Webster, and Louis Young, who vied for supremacy on the instrument. Berry's mastery of advanced harmony and his smoothly flowing solos on the up-tempo tunes influenced such young innovation as Dizzy Gillespie and Charlie Parker, so much so that Charlie Parker named his first son Leon in Chew's honor. During the 1960s and 70s, jazz artists began to experiment with standard chord and scale structures and the rhythm of traditional jazz. The result, often called free jazz, was an attempt to expand upon the improvisational and experimental aspects of bebop. Among free jazz artists were Sun Ra and saxophonist Ornette Coleman, Albert Ayer, and John Coltrane, the bassist Charlie Mingus, and the bassist, clarinet, and flutist Eric Dolphy. Rock and roll. In the early 1950s, rock and roll had a full head of steam. By the mid-1950s, as more and more white teenagers began to listen to different genres, the scope of the term rock and roll expanded and was primarily applied to white musicians such as Elvis Presley, Buddy Holly, Roy Orbison, or Bill Haley, whose music copied aspects of black musical styles but was aimed at white audiences. However, black musicians remained crucial to the development of rock and roll, even after the term was being applied mostly to white musicians. Chuck Berry, whose country-influenced bluesy tunes were extraordinarily successful with white audiences, exemplified the adolescent themes, rebellious sound and look, and aggressive guitar playings of early rock and roll. His Maybelline, Johnny B. Good, and Sweet Little 16 became rock standards almost immediately. This was also true of Little Richard, whose Tutti Frutti, Long Tall Sally, and Good Golly Miss Molly brought to early rock and roll a frenetic, updated version of New Orleans piano styles. Chuck Berry and Little Richard were enormously influential in England. In fact, the biggest rock groups of the 1960s, including the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, rebelled against the bland, sober sounds of white pop rockers like Pat Boone, Paul Anka, and began their careers by performing mostly cover versions of black rock and roll songs. Other musicians who played an important role in the development of rock and roll included Junior Parker, who recorded Mystery Train, Next Time You See Me, and Sweet Home Chicago, as well as Ike Turner, Jackie Preston, Willie Mae, Big Mama Thornton, the Isley Brothers, and Chubby Checker. During the late 1960s, relatively few black musicians remained involved in rock and roll, notable exceptions being Richie Havens and Jimi Hendrix, who had performed as an accompanist with Little Richard, the Isley Brothers, and Ike and Tina Turner before leading a popular rock ensemble himself. Wheeling native Billy Cox played bass alongside Jimi Hendrix as a part of his band. Soul music. In 1964, black popular music had acquired a new name, soul music. There was no clear chronological or stylistic division between rhythm and blues and soul music, but there are some important differences. Soul music displayed a more pronounced gospel influence, whether in up-tempo, unrestrained shouting or in slower, more plaintive styles. Furthermore, soul's general rejection of extended instrumentals, soloing, and marked the continuing retreat of jazz as the popular music of the black middle class. Finally, even though most soul music consisted of solo singing with vocal backgrounds, the influence of carefully arranged, close harmonies began to fade. It's no coincidence that soul flourished among the Black Pride movement. The music was made most exclusively by blacks, at first almost exclusively for blacks, and was part of a rising black middle class culture that celebrated black values and black styles in hair and clothing. In addition, soul's secular stance allowed the music to directly confront political issues central to African Americans. James Brown, who had a successful recording career throughout the 1950s, achieved his greatest popularity in the 1960s with live performances and forever-linked soul music and the Black Power movement with Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud. Two record companies, Atlantic and Motown, dominated the soul markets, starting in the late 1950s, and defined two major approaches. Atlantic and its Stax subsidiary often concentrated on funky instrumentals with a thrilling gospel feel, such as Wilson Pickett, Otis Redding, Percy Sledge, Sam and Dave. Aretha Franklin reached her prime at Atlantic in the mid-1960s by creating perhaps the defining performances of the soul genre. Her majestic, emotional voice made songs such as I've Never Loved a Man the Way I Love You, Respect, Chain of Fools, and Think, bona fide soul masterpieces. If Stax and Atlantic music cultivated a funky, gritty sound, the founder of Motown, Berry Gordy Jr., encouraged a sweeter sound. One that came to represent the classic and soul sound even more than Atlantic or Stax. Those efforts produced dozens of hits during Motown's peak years in the 1960s by figures such as Marvin Gaye, Stevie Wonder, Mary Wells, and Gladys Knight. Atlantic and Motown were by no means the only producers of soul music. In the 1970s, several vocal harmony groups were backed by sleek, electrified rhythms. Those groups included the Shy-Lights, the Stylistics, Harold Melvin and the Blue Notes, the OJs, the Spinners, and Earth, Wind and Fire. Solo singers in the soul genre included Roberta Flack, Barry White, Al Green, and Teddy Pendergrass, all of who created slow, emotional ballads and love songs. In the 1980s and 1990s, Whitney Houston and Luther Vandross contributed to the tradition of gospel-influenced singing characteristic of soul. Performing a little soul for you, Ezra Hamilton.
time, oh baby, oh baby, just sitting on the dock of the bay, wasting time. Looks like nothing gonna change. Everything just remains the same. I can't do it till people tell me to do, so I guess I've got to remain the same. Sitting here resting my home. This loneliness won't leave me alone. 2,000 miles I've roamed just to make this not my home. Now I guess I just sit on the dock of the bay, watching the tide roll away. Oh baby, just sitting on the dock of the bay, wasting time.
He even whistles good. Rhythm and blues, abbreviated R&B, is a term used to describe blues-influenced forms of music which have been predominantly performed and produced by African Americans since the late 1930s. The term rhythm and blues was created to replace the designation of race music, which until then was the standard catchphrase for all music made by blacks at the time. After the term race music was deemed offensive, Billboard began using the rhythm and blues, and it was not until the 1980s that the term R&B gained ordinary usage. With the transition from soul to R&B in the early to mid-1980s, solo singer Luther Vandross and new stars like Prince and Michael Jackson took over. Female R&B singers like Whitney Houston, Anita Baker, Patti LaBelle, and Janet Jackson gained great popularity during the last half of the decade. And Tina Turner, then into her 50s, came back with a series of hits with crossover appeal. Also popular was New Edition, a group of teenagers who served as a prototype for later boy bands such as New Kids on the Block and the Backstreet Boys. In 1986, Teddy Riley began producing R&B recordings that included influences from the increasingly popular genre of hip-hop. This combination of R&B style and hip-hop rhythms was termed New Jack Swing, and artists such as Keith Sweat, Guy, Jodeci, and Mary J. Blige were featured. Another popular but short-lived group with more pronounced R&B roots was Levert, whose lead singer Gerald Levert was the son of OJ's lead vocalist Eddie Levert. During the 1990s, highly successful artists such as Mariah Carey, girl group TLC, and the male supergroup Boyz II Men brought contemporary R&B to the mainstream. Boyz II Men and Mariah Carey individually recorded several Billboard Hot 100 #1 hits, including One Sweet Day, a collaboration between both acts, which became the longest running #1 hit in Hot 100 US history. In addition, both Boyz II Men and TLC released albums in 1994, 2 and Crazy Sexy Cool, respectively, that sold over 10 million copies, earning them diamond certification from the Recording Industries Association of America. Other top-selling R&B artists from this era included singer Toni Braxton, Usher, and the girl group En Vogue. From Etta James to The Temptations to Beyonce, R&B is an ever-growing, constantly expanding genre that doesn't necessarily have, want, or need a clear-cut definition. It is black popular music, whatever form that may be. And giving you guys a little R&B right now, Ezra Hamilton. Now we got some funk for you. In the mid to late 1960s, a new style known as funk began to dominate the charts. James Brown, who had been so influential in the 1950s and early 1960s in pioneering soul music, once again broke new ground, this time with stripped down, forceful rhythms and simple melodic riffs on Papa's Got a Brand New Bag. This style was picked up by Sly Stone on Dance to the Music, Everyday People, Hot Fun in the Summertime. George Clinton His Parliament and Funkadelic outfits made funk the ultimate party music, not just with their bizarre concept and humor, but their sheer excess. Huge ensembles of musicians and dancers all jamming on the same groove as long as they possibly could. The groove was the most important element of funk. All the instruments of the ensemble played off one another to create it and worked it over and over. Deep electric bass lines often served as main riffs with an interlocking web of short, catchy guitar chords and riffs and blaring horns over the top. Unlike nearly every form of R&B that had come before it, funk didn't confine itself to the 45 RPM single format and the classic verse-chorus song structure. Funk bands were just as likely to repeat a catchy chant or hook out of the blue than to give different songs equal weight. So as not to disrupt the groove of building like what was happening around the same time in blues, rock, and psychedelia, and hard rock. In fact, Jimi Hendrix was a major inspiration for funk guitar soloists. Other musicians who adopted the funk style included Isaac Hayes, who recorded the soundtrack to the movie Shaft in 1971, and Curtis Mayfield, who recorded Superfly in 1972. Artists such as Donna Summer, Gloria Gaynor, Kool and the Gang, and Rick James used a heavily funk-infused sound to usher in disco music as well. Many artists in the 1980s incorporated the funk sound into their music, including Prince, Duran Duran, The Talking Heads, Chaka Khan, and Cameo. During the early 1990s, funk witnessed a resurgence due to hip-hop music, with artists like Dr. Dre, Snoop Dogg, and Ice Cube. Its influence can be easily heard with the groups like Digital Underground and Outkast. Now my personal favorite right here, a little rap and hip hop for you. Hip hop is the most complex and influential genre of music to ever exist. Two of its earliest innovators were West Indians DJ Kool Herc and Grandmaster Flash. The Jamaican DJ Kool Herc was known for using massive speaker systems and multiple turntables to loop break beats into an endless groove of dance beats. Rapping is related to the African American tradition of toasting, a boastful form of storytelling that is usually political in content and aggressive in style. Early rappers worked with disc jockeys to heighten an audience's excitement. They often competed against one another, using their verbal skills and poetic dexterity to battle each other. Rap subject matter varies. Some rappers tell tragic tales of decaying neighborhoods, vicious crimes, and police brutality. Others celebrate black history, black families, and black communities, while others brag of their success in the bedroom, on the streets, and in the recording studios. Female rappers like Queen Latifah and Yo-Yo complicate these subjects by celebrating female empowerment. Above all, rap lyrics consistently attack economic and political inequalities, waging a full-scale assault on the institutions that keep most African Americans in poverty. The combination of gritty urban storytelling and beats driven technologically sophisticated keep hip-hop on the cutting edge of musical innovation. Since rap exploded into the mainstream in the 1980s, it has generated many different schools of styles: East Coast and West Coast, bounce, boom bap, double time, fast flows, backpack rap, and the most popular current form, mumble rap. While artists like Sugar Hill Gang, Run DMC, and LL Cool J paved the way for artists like Boogie Down Productions, Public Enemy, NWA, and Rakim, those artists cleared paths for artists like De La Soul, Tribe Called Quest, Nas, and Jay-Z, who ushered in the newest school of Drake, Kendrick Lamar, J. Cole, and the Migos. Although the rap music industry might have some questionable characters within it, there are a lot of rap artists who inspire us with truly spectacular lyrics and life lessons. I call this section our honorable mention section. Classical and opera. African Americans have also had a tradition of composers of classical music. The best known black composers of the early part of the 20th century are Florence Price, R. Nathaniel Dett, Harry T. Burleigh, Margaret Bonds, and William Garrett Still, who's been called the Dean of Afro-American composers. The number of African American writing classic music continued to grow with composers like Ulysses Kay, George Walker, Hale Smith, and Ollie Wilson. Born in our beloved city of Wheeling in 1916, Everett Lee learned to play violin and went on to become the first African American to conduct a major Broadway production, the first African American to conduct a major symphony orchestra in the South, and the first African American to conduct a major opera company in the United States. You can clap for that if you want to, it's all right with me. While several black female concert singers have achieved great popularity during the last 50 years, their success was not altogether new. Their way was paved earlier through classic singers like Elizabeth Taylor Greenfield, the first of the widely known black vocalists. Greenfield made her debut in 1853 in Philadelphia in a recital that was well reviewed in all the white press. Other early African American singers, all sopranos, were Nellie Mitchell Brown, Marie Salika Williams, Rachel Walker, and Flora Batson Burgeon. Like Taylor, these women were praised for their wide vocal range and the brilliance of their singing. Their careers were brief, however, and when the vogue for black sopranos ended in 1890, most retired to the concert stage. The performers broke racial barriers for African Americans, perhaps none as powerful as Marian Anderson, who was described by the Italian conductor Arturo Toscanini as possessing a voice which one hears once in 100 years. In 1955, although a hate group tried to prevent her from performing, Anderson became the first African American to sing at the Metropolitan Opera. After the 1950s, many other African American classical musicians came to the concert stage. The singers Robert McFerrin, Leontine Price, and pianist Andre Watts, and the conductor Michael Morgan. And this section was left out of our original production, but I thought of my boy right here, and I made sure it was in. Country music. Now, I don't have much of a soundtrack to go with it, so once again, I'm going to rely on the trusty hands of Ezra Hamilton. For many years, the influence and contributions of African American music and country music went mostly overlooked or overshadowed by their Caucasian counterparts. Blues and country harmonica player D. Ford Bailey wasn't just the first black performer on the Grand Ole Opry, he was the first performer ever to be introduced on the radio program that they called the Grand Ole Opry. On December 10, 1927, NBC radio announcer George D. Hay informed listeners that the previously known barn dance program would henceforth be known as the Grand Ole Opry. The very next performer that aired was DeFord. Bailey's story attests to the enduring contributions black artists have made in country music. Country is often viewed as a genre around which racial lines are neatly drawn, but black artists' influence on country can be traced back to the origins of broadcast music itself. Beginning with the very first hillbilly records in 1920 and 1930s, black singers and musicians have been involved in creation, performance, and recording of this genre as it attempts to capture the essence of daily life, aspirations, and ordinary American living. Early black figures in country often saw their efforts made invisible. Black guitarists like Leslie Riddle traveled southern United States with A.P. Carter, a founding member of the first Main Street country band, the Carter Family. Together, the two musicians collected songs from communities they visited. Riddle would learn the music, then teach the Carters how to play it for recordings and live performances. Other influences were Rufus T. Tot Payne, a blues guitarist and mentor to Hank Williams Sr. and Arnold Schultz, a fiddler and a guitarist who had a profound influence on guitar greats Merle Travis and Ike Everly, the father of the Everly Brothers. Bill Monroe, the father of bluegrass, credits Schultz for the first paid gig, as well as being a major influence in his playing style and the banjo that was ever prominent in bluegrass. Charlie Pride arrived in 1966 and became the first black American artist to experience country radio success. He's now a bona fide legend with more than 70 million records sold, 29 #1 hits, and a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Recording Academy. Pride was the first black country singer to perform at the Grand Ole Opry, closely followed by Linda Martell, the first black woman, and a regular performer over her 5-year music career. In 1969, around the same time, Oklahoma native Stoney Edwards began a career that produced a 15-chart country song. On October 23, 1971, It stands in the annals of history of the Wheeling Jamboree. On that date, an attendance record was set that has yet to be equaled. In his first Wheeling appearance, Charley Pride had an unprecedented 4-show sellout by more than 10,000 country music fans. Having just been named Male Vocalist of the Year and Entertainer of the Year at the annual Country Music Association Awards, Pride brought the capacity crowd to its feet during his 4 30-minute performances. A perfect modern day example of their influences and exchange of ideas is Darius Rucker, the 3rd African-American inducted into the Opry, who landed a smash hit in 2013 with his version of the Old Crow Medicine Show's Wagon Wheel. Rucker won a Grammy for the Best Country Solo Performance with Wagon Wheel. He exemplifies the continued impact of black artists on country music. Acts like the Carolina Chocolate Drops and their frontwoman, Rihanna Giddens, who was recently named a MacArthur Fellow for her work reclaiming African-American contributions to folk and country music. Meanwhile, black artists continue to become rising stars in contemporary country, as evidenced by Mickey Gutson, Reese Palmer, Tony Jackson, and Pandora's country artist to watch, Jimmy Allen. From sidemen to superstars, the talent and drive of these other new artists continue to prove that their participation in country music is anything but an anomaly. Now, the journey of the black musician has been one of survival, tolerance, acceptance, and resilience. The main components that have lasted through all genres have been creativity and innovation. Where doors were slammed shut and locked, the black artists coerced them open, blew them down, or made the party so live outside that you had to open them up just to join in. I'm sure there were artists, genres, songs, and topics that weren't covered today. But like we said, we have a bigger version of this that we'll be doing at Waterfront Wednesdays if our fingers are crossed. So make sure you mention that to the city. Anybody you can talk to in the city, make sure you let them know that you want this to happen. We ain't done yet. If you take anything away from this presentation tonight, please remember that Black American history is our history. We are all here this afternoon to acknowledge, learn, and celebrate our history. Because one of the things that happens more often than not with Black History Month and its presentations, it becomes something that is divisive in a way, where it's us bringing our culture to you, to show it to you, and convince you how great it is. When in actuality, it is our culture. These are our stories that have affected all of us. The Wheeling natives that we mentioned in here were plenty. So we not only have a stage in West Virginia as a state, but we have a stage in an area as big as music. Wheeling has a spot. So one more time for my man Ezra Hamilton. The silent but deadly Jermaine Lucius. Fine folks at the library for letting us put this on for you guys. And last but not least, yourselves for being a wonderful audience. Thank you very much.